Welcome to session number 3 of 30 Days to Understanding the Bible. I am your host, Jeanette Dubey, and I am here to teach you what I have learned, in reading this book. And of course, starting out good. Hey, it's not always going to go perfect every time. Well, hey, listen, let's dive into session number 3. If you've got your book, 30 Days to Understanding the Bible, I'm starting on page 30. If you don't and you haven't picked up the book yet, that's okay. I still would encourage you to follow along because you're still going to learn something, I think. This time we're talking about the historical books. And in session 3, our author, Max Anders, lays out for us 9 Old Testament eras, okay? And I have those up on the board, okay? So number 1 being creation. Number 2, patriarch. 3 is Exodus. 4, conquest. 5, judges. 6, kingdom. 7, exile. 8, return. And 9, silence. Now I will just share with you right up front that several years ago I had no idea that I could break down the Old Testament into 9 historical eras. And now I can recite them pretty good without looking. Isn't that fabulous? And you can too. So don't get discouraged if you don't remember them. It takes practice. But let's look at each of these eras, okay? Creation being when man was created, the animals, the plant life, the world as we know it. Patriarch era being the birth of the Hebrew people through a family of patriarchs that covers a period of about 200 years, okay? Exodus era is when, if you have read the Bible and you're familiar with the story of Moses, or perhaps you've seen Moses on television, you've probably seen the movie Moses on TV, where Moses goes into Egypt to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go, let my people go." The Israelites had been in slavery for over 400 years, and they have been crying out to God, we want freedom, we want to be released. It's not good here. And God hears their cries, and he sends Moses in to get them released. And so the Exodus era talks about that and goes into detail as to how that happened, what happened, how Moses went in there and got the people out, and how Pharaoh actually changed his mind and went after the people. And of course, it didn't end well with them in the Red Sea. So the Exodus era, okay? Well, next you have conquest, and that's with Joshua. Moses has died, and the mantle has been passed to Joshua. And Joshua is going to lead the Israelites into the promised land. And so we'll look at that era in more detail when we get to it. That's the conquest era, okay? Judges is about a 400-year period during which Israel is governed by judges. So that is the Judges era. They were rulers that were called judges. You had some good judges, and you had some bad judges. Now, judges as we know them today are men and women that wear black robes and have a gavel in their hand, and they sit at this tall desk, and it's formal, and it's in a room, etc. We're not necessarily talking about those kinds of judges with all the garb and so on. They probably had different outfits, but these judges had, I believe, a much bigger job than what our judges do, because they were overseeing a lot more people. So when we get to the Judges era, we're going to dive into that a little deeper. Kingdom. The Kingdom era is an additional 400-year period during which Israel becomes a full-fledged nation ruled by a monarchy, one king. So the Kingdom era, and this is where King David, if you've heard of King David, this is where King David comes into the story. And when we get to the Kingdom era, we're going to look at those things in detail. Exile. Now, the exile era is when the Israelites are invaded and taken over, and they're brought into exile, which means that they leave their homeland and they are taken to a foreign land as prisoners to live. And in the exile era, you have a couple of key players, foreign countries that came in and took over Israel. At that time, it was divided into northern and southern kingdom, which we'll look at the background of that. But you had Assyria that came in and took over the northern kingdom, and you had Babylon, which are the Babylonians, that came in and took over that and the southern kingdom, and so they ruled. If you want a reference on your map, then you would look at Babylon or Babylonia. It would be in modern-day Iraq, what we know as Iraq today. And for historical value, Babylonia or Babylon was not far from the area that they thought the Garden of Eden was once at. Remember, when we talk about the Garden of Eden, we don't have an exact pinpoint of where it was, but we think archaeologically, commentators feel that it was sitting somewhere between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers down by the Persian Gulf. But that's best guess is all I can tell you about that. Next, we have return, the return era. And the return era, the Babylonians were defeated by another foreign country who came in. I believe his name was Cyrus or Cyprus. King Cyrus or King Cyprus. I can't remember which one. But he came in and defeated the Babylonians. And eventually, he sent the Jewish people, the Israelites, he said, you can go home. And so many of them returned to Jerusalem. They did have some that stayed because they had now assimilated into the Babylonian culture and for whatever reason decided that's where they wanted to stay. So you do have some that are going to stay there, but you did have many that went back to Jerusalem. Now, I don't have the map on the board, but to give you an idea, just as a rough estimate, okay, of the type of travel we're talking about, okay. Initially, when we had our map before, we had Egypt over here, and we had Israel here, and if you remember, we had the Mediterranean Sea over here. And then over here, we had the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and we had the Persian Gulf over here. And Babylonia is over here. The Garden of Eden was over in this area. The land of Ur was over here. You had Egypt, Israel, Jerusalem over here. Well, at the time of the exile, when they were in Jerusalem and in this area, okay, the Babylonians came from over here and overtook them. All those people that they took into exile had to cross back over. And that's a long way. And remember, it's by foot. So it wasn't something that they just crossed over overnight. But it took a while to get there. So when King Cyprus, or King Cyrus, I think his name was, when he defeated the Babylonians, and he said, the Israelites, the Jewish people, can go home. Well, that meant going all the way back across the desert to go back to Jerusalem, which was over here. Okay, so if I had my map, you would be able to see it, but that gives you a good idea. It's not something that's around the corner. So always remember when we're talking about Old Testament life, the distances that they traveled were not small, and they didn't take place in a day or two. It could have actually been several weeks. It might have been several months. I don't really know, except to say that when you're traveling by foot, think how long it takes you to walk half a mile or a mile, and you're going at a pretty good clip, because usually we're exercising, right? They were walking, lots of people walking, tired, have to camp at night, and so on. So exile, you had some people that said, I'm perfectly fine with staying here and I don't want to go back. Okay, so we'll look at that in more detail as we get closer. And then the last era is silence. And that's about a 400-year period, and that's between the end of the Old Testament and the start of the New Testament. So Malachi finishing that up, and Matthew, the New Testament, starting up. And so you have 400-year period where didn't really hear from God. It was silence. You had new leaders come in that thought, well, I know better. I know how to do this. So that was all going on, and that was about a 400-year period. All right, so and it's basically the silence era, noted for ending the Old Testament period and beginning the New. Now, when we look at these eras, of course, you have main figures of each one. Okay, so for creation, your main figure is Adam. Okay, Adam and Eve in creation, your main figure being Adam, and your area that it happened is the Garden of Eden. Okay, Patriarch era, your main figure is Abraham, and his location that we assign to him is Canaan. So Abraham being the patriarch, that he's the main figure in the Patriarch era. The Exodus era would be Moses. Okay, and we just talked about that a little bit ago. Moses going to Egypt, which would be the main area, and leading the people out of slavery. Conquest era, the main figure would be Joshua. Okay, and his land, always want to make sure I get these right, would be Canaan. Yeah, it would be Canaan, because remember, he's leading the people into the promised land. Moses was on his way, and then something happened and he couldn't finish it, and we'll talk about that in detail later. But then Joshua picked up the baton and he was leading them into the promised land, which is the land of Canaan. All right, your next figure is Judges, and the most notable judge during that era is Samson. And Samson would also be in the land of Canaan. Then you get to the kingdom era, and you have David, King David, and that area that he was noted for, or noted in, would be Israel. Then you have exile, and your main figure for the exile era was Daniel, and the location was Babylonia. Then you have the return era, and your main figure there is Ezra, and his area was Jerusalem. And then last but not least, silence era, and that's where we see the Pharisees and the Sadducees come in. So the Pharisees being the main people in that era, and Jerusalem being the area that we focus on. So there you have your main character, your era, okay, one of these 9 main eras, and you have the area that it took place. If you can grasp that, then you are well on your way to understanding the Old Testament and how it's laid out. And forgive me, my dog is trying to contribute here. So, but if you can grasp those things, you are well on your way to figuring out the layout of the Old Testament. it helps to have, in each era, what I like that Max does is that he takes each era, and we're going to look at these as we go through the sessions. He takes each era and he actually breaks it down into like 4 subdivisions, 4 subtopics. And then we look at those 4 subtopics briefly, like a summary. And that really helps it click. Really helps the information come together, which will help us have a better understanding. And like I've said earlier, this is a basic overview. So there is so much more to the Bible than what just this book is going to give us. So I would encourage you to dive in and read the stories. When we start talking about creation and the patriarch era and Exodus and conquest and all of that, I would encourage you to read the stories about those things, because that'll just give you so much more of the detail. And then knowing who your main figures are just makes it so much easier. So, and that's how I did it. That's how I did it, following along, using this as an outline and diving into more detail to put the story together. Because remember, what you have in the Old Testament is the first 17 books of the Bible are your historical books. They tell the story of what happened. Then your 5 poetical books and your 17 prophetical, prophecy, they're written during the time the historical books were written. They're not in addition to, where they continue the story, but they're actually part of, they were written during. So when you're reading Psalms, for example, and you're reading about David and how he feels about being pursued by Saul through the desert, through caves, through the wilderness, through whatever, he is expressing how he feels about what's going on in Psalms. But it happened, and the story of what happened is in 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel. It's in those areas, in those books of the Bible, that you read. My dog is really loving this. That you read about these things. But in Psalms, you read how he feels. So it can be confusing because some people will say, I read all of that and then I'm reading about him again and I don't quite get it. And that's because it was written at the same time. Okay. Many people pick up the Bible and they just think, well, we just read from beginning to end like any good book. Like any good book, you start at page 1 and you read all the way through. Well, the Bible's not necessarily like that. You're going to read the first 17 books of the Bible, but it's important that you put them in chronological order. And there are chronological Bibles out there that do that for us. They put them in order so that you can read the story. Now, I have to tell you, it does make it nice. I understood it a little better. This book here that we're studying will actually show you a timeline of when Job was written or when Psalms were written or Proverbs. Those extra books, those prophetical books, those poetry books, it will show you those things. So just a couple of helpful hints for you. I think if you can get that down, that will help you read the Bible and be able to understand the story. So hopefully there was something that was helpful tonight. I pray that it was. I thank you for watching. I really enjoyed doing this. And so I'm looking forward to the next 37 sessions. Lord willing, we'll be recording those. And then after that, I'm going to teach something else. If this is going well and people are interested and you like it, I'm going to just try and keep on teaching. I'll find something else to teach. So have a great day. And just know, if you don't know already, that you are so loved by the Creator of the world. Don't ever forget that. All right. Take care.